In September of 1990, a road crew working beside Interstate 40 in North Carolina made a discovery that would haunt investigators for more than 3 decades. Hidden down an embankment near the New Hope Church Road exit were the remains of a young woman. Nobody knew her name or where she had come from. The only clue that seemed remotely distinctive was the clothing that she was wearing. A pink sweatshirt decorated with 3 cartoon rabbits, 2 riding bicycles and 1 riding a unicycle. Investigators hoped somebody would recognize it, that somebody would come looking for the woman. Perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member, even somebody who had simply seen the young woman shortly before she met her end. But nobody came forward. On September 19, 1990, maintenance workers were carrying out routine duties near Interstate 40 in Orange County, North Carolina. The area sat close to the New Hope Church Road exit, a stretch of highway used by thousands of drivers every day. At some point during their work, the crew noticed something unusual down a nearby embankment. When authorities arrived, they discovered the remains of a mysterious young woman. Investigators believed she had been there for several days, possibly as long as a week or 9 days. The location immediately raised questions. Although the site was positioned near a busy interstate, the area where the woman was found was concealed enough that passing motorists would have had little chance of noticing her. Detectives quickly began documenting every detail they could. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. She stood between approximately 5 feet 3 inches and 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed around 110 to 115 pounds. She had brown or strawberry blonde hair with lighter highlights, and investigators noted that she had previously undergone an appendectomy. She bore the scar on her midriff. They also found evidence of quite a lot of dental work, including several fillings. There was also signs that she needed some more dental work carrying out, and this could suggest a change in circumstances for her towards the end of her time. Yet none of those details helped answer the most important question. Exactly who was she? Among the items recovered from the scene was a bracelet and a ring. She was also wearing white socks. What drew the most attention, however, was a pink sweatshirt featuring 3 cartoon rabbits. 2 of the rabbits appeared to be riding bicycles, while the third rode a unicycle. It was an unusual design. It could be exactly the kind of detail that investigators hoped would generate leads. If somebody recognized the sweatshirt, they might recognize the woman. If they recognized the woman, they might finally have a name. There was also another detail that puzzled investigators. Although the woman was wearing socks, her shoes were missing. Even more unusual was the condition of the socks themselves. Reports indicated they were remarkably clean. Over the years, that small detail would generate considerable discussion among both investigators and amateur sleuths. Had the shoes simply been lost somewhere before the woman was discovered? Had somebody removed them? Or did the missing footwear point towards something more significant? At the time, there was no way to know. The investigation was only beginning. And before detectives could identify a suspect, they first needed to identify the victim herself. The problem was that nobody seemed to know who she was. As investigators worked to identify the young woman, they quickly discovered they were facing an unusually difficult case. There was no identification at the scene, nor were there any missing persons reports that immediately matched her description. So, was this young lady even being missed by anyone at all? There was also no obvious connection to Orange County. In fact, detectives were not even certain whether she was from North Carolina where she was found. The location she was discovered at only complicated matters further. Interstate 40 stretches across multiple states and serves as a major transportation route. If the woman had been transported there, she could have come from almost anywhere. Investigators began pursuing every lead they could find. They interviewed potential witnesses. They also reviewed missing persons reports from North Carolina and beyond. Descriptions of the victim circulated to law enforcement agencies across the country. Nothing produced a positive identification. There were some glimmers of hope appearing, though. One potentially promising lead came from reports of a young woman seen in the days before the discovery. Witnesses described someone who appeared similar to the victim and who may have been traveling through the Burlington area. Some reports suggested the woman may have been walking near major roadways and truck stops. However, investigators were never able to conclusively prove whether the sightings involved the victim. As the months passed, the case grew colder. Detectives turned to forensic artists in the hope that a visual reconstruction might finally generate answers. Using the victim's skull, specialists created a facial reconstruction designed to approximate what she may have looked like in life. The reconstruction was distributed publicly. Investigators hoped that somebody would recognize the face. Perhaps an old friend would see it, or a relative would recognize familiar features. Or maybe somebody who had lost contact years earlier would now finally realize what had happened. But nobody came forward. The reconstruction generated attention, but not identification. Years later, as technology improved, investigators tried again. Digital artists created updated illustrations based on the original forensic work. There were now multiple artists' impressions of what the woman could have looked like. Some digital, some hand-drawn, and some were painstakingly built using clay. These images were distributed online and shared through social media. Once again, detectives hoped that modern technology would succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Once again, though, the trail went nowhere. The woman still remained unidentified. During this period, she became known by several different names. Some investigators referred to her as the I-40 Jane Doe or the Hillsborough Jane Doe. Others called her the New Hope Jane Doe because of the nearby road exit. Some simply called her Hope. But regardless of the nickname, the reality remained the same. The woman in the rabbit sweatshirt still had no name. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was how distinctive some of the evidence appeared to be. The rabbit sweatshirt seemed memorable, as did the bracelet. The circumstances seemed memorable too. Yet year after year, nobody recognized the woman. At some point, investigators even attempted to trace the origins of the sweatshirt itself. The design featured 3 cartoon rabbits and appeared unusual enough that somebody might remember where it had been sold. Researchers eventually linked the artwork to illustrator Jim Benton and a clothing company called Sportsweats. The design had reportedly been distributed through retailers across the United States during the 1980s. While this answered questions about the sweatshirt, it did not answer questions about the woman wearing it. The discovery ultimately led nowhere. As the years passed, investigators followed hundreds of leads. Each one seemed to offer a possibility. Each one eventually ended in disappointment. The case gradually transformed from an active investigation into one of North Carolina's most enduring mysteries. By the time the case reached its 3rd decade, many people had begun to wonder whether the young woman would ever get her name back. Meanwhile, investigators were beginning to examine another possibility. What if identifying the victim was only part of the mystery? What if the person responsible for leaving her beside Interstate 40 had already appeared on law enforcement's radar years earlier? As investigators continued searching for answers, attention occasionally turned toward individuals whose crimes appeared to share similarities with the case. One of those individuals was a taxi driver named Keith Allen Brown. Brown became known to law enforcement after being connected to violent crimes involving women in North Carolina during the same period. The timing immediately attracted attention. Lisa's remains had been discovered in September of 1990. Around that same time, Brown was operating as a taxi driver in the region. Authorities began examining whether there could be any connection. What drew attention was not just geography. It was also the circumstances surrounding some of Brown's known crimes. Investigators noticed certain similarities involving vulnerable women, roadside locations, and the disposal of victims. Some reports indicated that Brown was questioned about the Orange County case. However, no public evidence ever emerged, proving that he was responsible. Authorities never announced charges against him in connection with the murder. Brown reportedly neither admitted nor denied involvement when questioned. As a result, investigators were left with another possibility rather than a definitive answer. The theory remained exactly that, a theory. Even so, the similarities were difficult to ignore. Another detail that attracted attention involved location names. One of Brown's known victims was discovered near a road called Mount Hope Church Road, and this unidentified woman had been found near New Hope Church Road. The similarities were striking enough that people discussing the case continued to bring them up years later. Yet similarities alone are not evidence. Investigators still needed solid proof, but that proof never arrived. As the years passed, other theories emerged. Some researchers focused on the missing shoes, others focused on witness sightings, others examined possible links to traveling offenders who used interstate highways. But every theory shared the same problem. Nobody knew who the victim was. Without a name, detectives were trying to solve a puzzle while missing half the pieces. The victim's entire life remained a blank page. They did not know where she had lived, who her friends were, or who she had been spending time with before her life came to an end. They did not even know which state she called home, and until those questions were answered, identifying a suspect would remain extraordinarily difficult. For decades, that reality kept the case frozen in place. Then, in 2020, a new investigator took over, and hidden inside the evidence collected 30 years earlier was a tiny fragment that would change everything. By 2020, the case had already frustrated generations of investigators. The woman in the rabbit sweatshirt had remained unidentified for nearly 30 years. Hundreds of leads had been exhausted. Multiple forensic reconstructions had failed, and public appeals had failed too. Even advances in technology had failed to produce a breakthrough. Then investigator Dylan Hendricks took over the case. Like many cold case investigators, Hendricks faced a difficult question. What evidence still existed that previous investigators had not been able to fully utilize? The answer turned out to be remarkably small. Among the evidence preserved from the original investigation was a degraded hair fragment. For decades, it had remained largely useless. When the woman was discovered in 1990, DNA technology was still in its early stages. Investigators could use DNA to compare known individuals against evidence. What they could not do was use it to identify an unknown victim who had no known relatives in the system. 30 years later, that situation had changed dramatically. Hendricks submitted the hair fragment for modern DNA testing. The sample was sent to Astrea Forensics, a laboratory specializing in difficult forensic extractions. And despite the age and condition of the evidence, scientists successfully recovered a usable DNA profile. For the first time in decades, investigators had a realistic path toward identifying the victim. The next step involved forensic genealogy. Rather than searching for the victim directly, investigators searched for people who might just be related. Forensic genealogist Leslie Kaufman joined the investigation and began analyzing the DNA profile. Using genealogy databases and family tree research, Kaufman gradually started identifying potential relatives. The process was slow and painstaking. Every branch of a family tree had to be examined. Every possible connection had to be verified. Eventually, investigators identified individuals who appeared to be paternal cousins of the unidentified woman. That discovery gave detectives something they had never possessed before, a clear direction. Investigators began interviewing family members. As they worked through the family tree, a pattern began to emerge. There was one name that kept appearing, one relative who seemed to fit exactly where the DNA suggested she should be. Yet nobody seemed to know where she had gone. Years earlier, she had simply just disappeared from the family. Later, Hendricks would describe the discovery in a phrase that became widely quoted. He explained that there was a Lisa-shaped hole in the family tree. exactly where the DNA suggested the victim should be. Investigators then obtained additional DNA from a maternal relative. The comparison provided the final confirmation they needed. After more than 30 years, the woman in the rabbit sweatshirt finally had a name. She was not a Jane Doe. She was not Hope. She was not the unidentified woman beside Interstate 40. Her name was Lisa Coburn Kessler. And as investigators began learning about her life, they realized the identification had answered one mystery, while creating several more.
Investigators in Orange County have been working for more than 3 decades to identify a murder victim, and now, thanks to new technology, they have.
It's a big update. WREL's Grace Holland joins us now with this story. Grace, talk about what led to this discovery.
Lena and Chris, DNA was still very new science back in 1990 when road crews found a woman's body along I-40 East near New Hope Church Road. At the time, they made this reconstruction based off of her skull, but they still wouldn't know for decades that it was 20-year-old Lisa Kessler. It's believed someone strangled her to death. Back then, detectives relied on witnesses and missing persons reports. They created digital pictures like this of her a few years later when that technology came along, but sharing it on social media never brought them any leads. The sheriff says now the focus will shift to hopefully finding Kessler's killer. Of course, there is no statute of limitations on murder.
When authorities publicly announced the identification in September 2023, one mystery was finally solved. The young woman found beside Interstate 40 had been Lisa Coburn Kessler. She always had been. She was 20 years old when her life came to an end. She had spent most of her life in Jackson County, Georgia. Almost immediately, investigators began trying to reconstruct the missing chapters of her life. What they discovered was quite unusual. Lisa had family connections in both Georgia and Michigan. At some point before her death, different branches of her family had come to different conclusions about where she was living. Family members in one location believed she had gone elsewhere. Family members elsewhere believed she had returned home. As a result, nobody realized she was missing at all. It is one of the most remarkable and disturbing aspects of the entire case. Poor Lisa was seemingly never even missed by her own family. For more than 3 decades, investigators searched for a missing woman who had never officially been reported missing. The identification also led to another discovery. After Lisa's name became public, a journalist in her hometown located high school yearbook photographs that investigators themselves had been unable to find. For the first time, the public could finally see the face behind the mystery. The woman in the reconstruction was now a real person. She had a name and now had a history too. She had people who remembered her. Yet many questions remained unanswered. Sheriff Charles Blackwood made a particularly interesting comment while discussing the case. Without revealing specific details, he described Lisa's life as very complex. Exactly what he meant by that has never been fully explained, but I hope one day it is. I feel like the sheriff has clickbaited us with that one. The statement immediately attracted attention because it suggested investigators had learned far more about Lisa's background than they were prepared to disclose. The sheriff also revealed something else. Investigators had identified a person of interest they intended to interview. More intriguingly, he stated that the individual had been interviewed before. Exactly when that interview occurred and what relationship the person may have had to Lisa was not disclosed. The announcement raised a new series of questions like, had investigators unknowingly spoken to somebody connected to the case years earlier? Had identifying Lisa suddenly caused old evidence to make sense? Or had her newly reconstructed life pointed detectives towards somebody they had previously overlooked? Authorities have not publicly provided those answers. What they have said is that the investigation remains active. For the first time in decades, detectives are no longer trying to identify the victim. They are trying to identify the person responsible. The mystery that began in September of 1990 is not over, but at least Lisa finally has her name back. Nobody knew who she was, nobody knew where she came from, and nobody knew how she had ended up there. At first, investigators believed they had several strong clues. The woman had distinctive dental work, unusual physical characteristics, and what appeared to be evidence pointing toward a specific background. It seemed likely that identifying her would simply be a matter of time. But time kept passing. Years turned into decades. Every lead failed to give this young woman her name back. Every comparison to known missing women came back empty. Missing persons databases were searched across the United States and Canada. Experts studied the remains. New theories emerged. None of them brought investigators any closer to the truth. Decades would pass before a bombshell would drop. That would change everything. The discovery happened in a remote area east of Missoula near Crystal Creek Road. A hunter had been following a wounded bear through heavily wooded terrain when he noticed bones scattered across a hillside. At first glance, the remains appeared old. There was little left beyond the skeleton itself. Whatever it was that happened here had happened a long time earlier. Authorities quickly secured the area and began examining the scene. The victim was female. Her time on this earth had not come to an end naturally. 2 .32 caliber bullets were recovered from her skull, indicating that she had been shot in the head at close range. The condition of the remains suggested she had likely been dead for at least a year before being discovered. What immediately complicated the investigation was the complete lack of personal belongings. There was no clothing, there was no identification, there were no personal effects. There was nothing that could immediately tell investigators who this woman had been or where she had come from. That absence of evidence would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Normally, even when a victim cannot be identified immediately, detectives have something to work with. A driver's license, a piece of jewelry, a unique item of clothing, or even something as simple as a receipt can provide a starting point. In this case, there was nothing. The victim seemed to have been erased. Investigators therefore turned their attention to the remains themselves. They began constructing a profile using the only evidence available to them. The woman appeared to be a young adult. She was small in stature, standing somewhere around 5 feet tall, and weighing approximately 100 pounds. Her hair was described as brown, thin, and naturally wavy. Some experts believed it may have been chemically treated during her life. Without a name, detectives assigned her a temporary one, Christy Crystal Creek. It was simply a practical label based on the location where she had been found. Nobody expected that name to remain attached to the case for more than 30 years. At that point, investigators still believed the mystery would eventually be solved through conventional forensic work. Unfortunately, the very evidence they relied upon would end up leading them in the wrong direction. The most important clues in the case came from the victim's teeth. The dental examination revealed something unusual. This woman had received extensive dental treatment during her life. She had numerous fillings, multiple dental procedures, evidence of oral surgery, and at least 2 root canals. One tooth appeared to have been extracted relatively shortly before her death. Among these findings was a screw-in dental post that attracted particular attention. To investigators in the mid-1980s, it appeared different from the types of dental work commonly seen in the United States. Some experts believed the procedure resembled techniques more often associated with parts of Asia. At roughly the same time, anthropological assessments of the skeletal remains suggested the possibility of Asian ancestry. Taken together, the findings appeared to reinforce one another. The victim was believed to be a young woman of Asian descent, possibly even Japanese ancestry. It seemed like a valuable lead. The problem was that the theory gradually evolved from a possibility into an assumption. As years passed, investigators increasingly searched for missing women who matched that profile. Additional observations appeared to add more detail to the picture. Staining on one side of the victim's teeth suggested she may have been a smoker. Examination of her skeletal structure also indicated that she may previously have carried a pregnancy and possibly given birth. Slowly, investigators began constructing a portrait of the unidentified woman. It seemed like enough information to eventually identify her, yet every attempt failed. Missing persons reports from across the United States were reviewed. Canadian databases were searched. Potential matches were investigated and eliminated. New leads appeared and disappeared. But nothing worked. The woman found near Crystal Creek remained anonymous. Looking back, the reason seems obvious. Investigators were searching for a woman who did not exist. Not because the victim was fictional, but because one of the central assumptions guiding the investigation was wrong. The real woman behind the nickname was someone else entirely. Before that mistake would be exposed, however, another name began appearing repeatedly in the investigation. That name was Wayne Nance. Even while detectives struggled to identify Christy Crystal Creek, many believed they had a likely suspect in her death. Wayne Nance was one of the most notorious criminals ever associated with western Montana. Later nicknamed the Missoula Mauler, Nance was suspected of multiple murders committed throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Although he was never formally convicted of homicide, investigators eventually linked him to several violent crimes. What made Nance particularly relevant to this case was not simply his reputation. It was where Christy Crystal Creek's body had been found. The Crystal Creek area was known to investigators because of its connection to Nance. According to later accounts, it was one of the locations he was known to frequent. More significantly, another young female victim associated with Nance had been found nearby. That victim became known as Debbie Deer Creek. Like Christy Crystal Creek, she remained unidentified for years. She was discovered in the same general area outside Missoula, and like Christy Crystal Creek, she had suffered shots to the head. Eventually, Debbie was identified as 16-year-old Marcella Bachman. Evidence connecting Bachman to Nance was substantial. Photographs of the pair together were later found among Nance's possessions. Witnesses had seen them together before her disappearance. Investigators strongly believed he was responsible for her death. The similarities between the two cases immediately stood out. Two young women discovered in isolated locations with the same cause of demise, and two bodies found within a relatively small geographic area that is connected to Wayne Nance. The deeper investigators looked, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that Christy Crystal Creek was another victim. Yet there was a problem. At this point, nobody even knew who she was. The suspicion surrounding Wayne Nance never completely disappeared. In fact, it only grew stronger after his death. In September 1986, Nance's time came to an end while attacking a married couple in their own home. During the attack, one of the victims managed to free himself and fight back. Nance suffered fatal injuries and passed the following day. This event really changed everything. Had he survived, investigators might eventually have questioned him about Christy Crystal Creek. They might have confronted him with evidence, searched for inconsistencies in his statements, or discovered links between him and unsolved crimes. There was even a real outside chance of a confession. Instead, whatever Nance knew died with him. The investigation into Christy Crystal Creek, therefore, entered a frustrating limbo. Detectives suspected they might know who was responsible, but they could not prove it. At the same time, they still did not know who the victim was. For years, the case remained frozen between those two unanswered questions. Who was she? And who was responsible for what happened? Investigators continued pursuing every avenue available to them. Missing persons databases were searched throughout the United States and Canada. Dental records were reviewed repeatedly. Forensic profiles were updated as scientific techniques improved. Nothing ever produced an answer. One person who became particularly invested in the mystery was Sidney Bacon, a graduate student at the University of Montana. In 2004, Bacon selected Christy Crystal Creek as the subject of her forensic anthropology thesis. What began as an academic project gradually became something much more personal. She spent countless hours studying the remains, measuring bones, reviewing reports, and attempting to learn everything possible about the woman behind the nickname. Her analysis helped refine aspects of the victim's profile. It reinforced many of the observations already made by earlier investigators and provided additional detail about the woman's life before her death. Yet even after years of study, the central mystery remained unsolved. Still, nobody knew who Christy Crystal Creek was. Bacon later spoke about how strange it felt that the remains had spent decades sitting in evidence storage without a name attached to them. To her, this was not simply a case file or an academic exercise. It was a real person whose identity had somehow disappeared. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more unusual it became. Most unidentified remains cases eventually narrow toward a likely identity. Family members report someone missing. Records begin to align. Investigators establish connections that gradually close the gap between victim and name. But that never happened. Instead, every comparison failed. Looking back, the reason seems painfully obvious. The victim did not match the profile that investigators believed that she matched. For more than 3 decades, they were effectively searching for the entirely wrong person. The breakthrough would not come from another reconstruction, another forensic report, or another database search. It would come from technology that did not exist when the remains were first discovered. In 2021, the Missoula County Sheriff's Office decided to take a different approach. The agency partnered with Othram, a laboratory specializing in advanced DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. By this point, genetic genealogy had already transformed numerous cold case investigations across the United States. Cases that had resisted identification for decades were suddenly being solved through family tree research and advanced DNA profiling. Investigators hoped the same thing might happen here. The challenge was significant. The remains had been exposed to the elements for years before discovery, and then stored for decades afterward. Recovering usable DNA from evidence in that condition is never guaranteed. Nevertheless, amazingly, scientists were able to develop a genetic profile from the remains. That profile became the foundation of a forensic genetic genealogy investigation. Researchers began identifying distant relatives. Family trees were constructed, branches were followed, connections were tested, and gradually a picture emerged. The trail eventually led investigators to a family in Spokane, Washington. Additional interviews followed, records were reviewed. DNA comparisons were conducted to confirm the findings. Then, after 36 years, the mystery was finally solved. Christy Crystal Creek finally had a real name. She was actually named Janet Lee Lucas. She was 23 years old when her time came to an end. She had grown up in California and Washington, and she had 7 siblings. And she had disappeared during the summer of 1983. The identification immediately revealed something remarkable. Janet was not of Asian ancestry, which means that one of the most influential assumptions in the entire investigation had been totally wrong. The unusual dental work and early anthropological assessments had unintentionally pointed investigators toward a demographic profile that did not accurately describe the victim. As a result, detectives spent decades searching for missing women who matched characteristics that Janet herself did not possess. The discovery was both extraordinary and extremely frustrating. Extraordinary because one of Montana's most enduring unidentified remains cases had finally been solved. Frustrating because it demonstrated just how close the truth may have been all along. The woman found near Crystal Creek wasn't a mystery because nobody was looking for her. Instead, the mystery was because investigators were looking through the wrong lens. Now that they finally knew her name, attention shifted to an entirely different question. What had happened to Janet Lucas after she disappeared? Once Janet's identity became known, investigators were finally able to begin reconstructing her life. Instead of simply analyzing her remains, they learned that she was a mother. At the time of her disappearance, she actually had a 5-year-old son. Family members described her as warm, caring, and deeply loved. Despite the decades that had passed, she had never been forgotten. Investigators also established the last confirmed chapter of her life. Janet was last seen in Sandpoint, Idaho, during the summer of 1983. After that, the trail abruptly ends. No other records place her in Montana. No witnesses have publicly confirmed seeing her in Missoula. There is also no clear explanation that has emerged for how she traveled from Idaho to the area where her remains were eventually discovered. That missing period remains an important unanswered question in the case. Some accounts suggest Janet was living a transient lifestyle at the time. Others indicate she may have been hitchhiking and moving between locations. Regardless of the exact circumstances, investigators still cannot fully account for the period between her disappearance and her death. That uncertainty keeps the Wayne Nance theory alive. The similarities that raised suspicion before Janet's identification remain just as compelling today. Yet similarities are not proof. More than 40 years after Janet was last seen alive, investigators have not publicly established definitive evidence linking Nance to her death. As a result, the homicide remains officially unsolved. For Janet's family, however, the identification still represented something profoundly important. For decades, they lived without knowing where she was. Her son spent much of his adult life searching for answers. Family members continued hoping that one day they would learn what had happened. In 2021, they finally received part of that answer. Janet was no longer a Jane Doe. She was no longer Christy Crystal Creek. She was, once again, Janet Lee Lucas.
After more than 30 years, a woman's remains in a cold case known as Christy Crystal Creek have been identified. The Missoula County Sheriff's Office announced the skeletal remains of a woman found by a bear hunter in 1985 near Crystal Creek are those of 23-year-old Janet Lee Lucas of Spokane. Despite years of forensic work and hours of searching missing persons databases, Lucas's remains were only identified recently due to help from the Montana Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Program and the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. Advanced DNA analysis and interviews with family and DNA testing helped MCSO conclusively identify her remains. In a statement, Janet Lucas's family writes in part, not only was she a mother, she was a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a friend, and now a grandmother to 4 beautiful children. We are grateful to finally be able to bring her home to us, as well as bring Janet the peace and rest she deserves. The Missoula County Sheriff's Office says their focus is now changing from who is Christy Crystal Creek to what happened to Janet Lucas. The cold case unit is reviewing evidence and reports from the Wayne Nance case file to identify any possible link between Nance and Lucas. Nance was a suspect in several murders during that time before he was killed while reportedly breaking into a home in 1986. It's been determined Lucas was last seen in Sandpoint, Idaho in the summer of 1983. And if you have any information regarding this case, you're asked to contact the Sheriff's Office.
This case began with a hunter discovering human remains on a hillside outside Missoula. For 36 years, investigators attempted to identify the victim using every traditional method available to them. They studied her bones, analyzed her dental work, created reconstructions, reviewed missing persons reports, and followed countless leads. None of it worked. The breakthrough came only when DNA technology exposed a mistake that had quietly influenced the investigation from the beginning. Investigators believed they knew what kind of woman they were looking for. They didn't. Once that assumption was removed, Christy Crystal Creek finally became Janet Lee Lucas, a daughter, a sister, a mother, a woman whose family never stopped searching for her. Today, her identity is no longer a mystery. The mystery is what happened after she disappeared from Idaho in 1983. Whether Wayne Nance was responsible or whether someone else ended Janet's time on this earth remains unknown. What is known is that after 36 years of anonymity, Janet Lucas finally got her name back. The search for justice is still ongoing. Christmas morning arrives in Clarksville, Tennessee. 3 young children wake up excited for presents. Their mother is nowhere to be seen. At first, nobody fully understands that something is wrong. The youngest child is only 2 years old. Another is 4. Their son is 6. The family had only recently moved into the area after Susan's husband was reassigned through the military. They did not have a car, nor did they have a phone. And according to her family, Susan Lund had spent the previous months trying to adjust to a completely different life. The night before, on Christmas Eve, 1992, the 25-year-old reportedly left home around 7:30 p.m. to walk to a grocery store. And then she never came back. For years, some people believe Susan had simply abandoned her family. There were reported sightings and rumors, even claims that she was alive in another state. But nearly 30 years later, investigators would uncover something that completely changed the case. Hundreds of miles away from Clarksville, hidden inside a cold case file that had remained unsolved since the early 1990s, was a horrifying discovery nobody had connected to Susan at the time. And the truth raised even more disturbing questions than the disappearance itself. Susan Maynard Lund was born on November 29, 1967. She grew up in Indiana as part of a large family and was known by relatives as outgoing, caring, and deeply attached to the people around her. Her sisters later described her as someone who loved animals so much that she constantly brought home stray cats and dogs. According to family members, she especially had a soft spot for injured animals. Years later, her daughter Crystal would remember one story in particular. Susan had apparently crawled underneath a dirty, unstable shed just to rescue a small kitten for her daughter. That memory stayed with Crystal for the rest of her life. Susan eventually married her high school sweetheart, Paul Lund. Paul served in the military and had recently returned from Germany before being stationed near Fort Campbell, close to the Tennessee-Kentucky border. The couple relocated to Clarksville, Tennessee, sometime in late 1992. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, the move appears to have placed the family under increasing pressure, and the Lunds were reportedly struggling financially. They lived in military housing off base. They did not yet own a car. They also did not have a home phone installed. That meant Susan often had to walk long distances for basic errands, while caring for 3 small children. At the time she disappeared, those children were just 6, 4, and 2 years old. Susan was also reportedly pregnant with her 4th child. According to her sisters, she missed her family badly after the move to Tennessee. Back in Indiana, she had been surrounded by relatives. Now she was isolated in a new state, without transportation and without much support nearby. But despite the difficulties, relatives said Susan loved spending time with her children. Because she was no longer working during the day, she finally had the opportunity to stay home with them full-time and watch them grow. Her sisters later recalled how much that meant to her. That detail would later become extremely important to the people who knew her best. Because almost immediately after Susan vanished, rumors began spreading that she had voluntarily abandoned her children and started a new life elsewhere. And according to her family, that theory never made sense. December 24, 1992, started as a fairly ordinary Christmas Eve. Susan had reportedly spent the day at home with the children while preparing for Christmas morning. At some point that evening, she allegedly decided she needed to go out for groceries. According to later reporting, she may have wanted ingredients for a last-minute pie. But one detail has continued to confuse both investigators and people following the case ever since. The grocery store she supposedly planned to walk to was several miles away, and because it was Christmas Eve, there is a strong possibility the store had already closed by the time she left home. That uncertainty has remained one of the first strange details in the case. Susan's daughter Crystal would later remember begging to go with her mother that night. Susan told her no. It was the last time Crystal ever saw her alive. Around 7:30 p.m., Susan reportedly left the family home on foot. The weather was cold. She carried her checkbook with her, and then she disappeared. When Susan failed to come home later that evening, concern quickly began building inside the house. By Christmas morning, it was clear something was seriously wrong. Paul Lund contacted police and reported his wife missing. Search efforts began almost immediately. Investigators searched around Clarksville, while family members desperately tried to understand what could have happened. At first, the disappearance appears to have been treated seriously. Susan was a pregnant mother with 3 young children. She had vanished on foot at night during winter, and according to relatives, there was no indication she planned to leave permanently. But almost as quickly as the search began, confusion started entering the investigation. Police began receiving reports that Susan had been seen in different locations after Christmas Eve. Some callers claimed they saw her in Tennessee. Others reported sightings in Kentucky. One report allegedly placed her near Interstate 65 outside Louisville. Another suggested she was in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Investigators at the time apparently considered some of these sightings credible. And that changed the direction of the case dramatically, because once authorities started believing Susan may have left voluntarily, the urgency behind the investigation appears to have weakened. Meanwhile, Susan's family struggled with details that did not fit that theory at all. Paul reportedly pointed out that no checks had been written from the checkbook Susan carried when she disappeared. Family members also questioned why Susan would suddenly abandon 3 small children she had been deeply attached to. And there was another issue. If Susan truly had run away to start a new life, why had nobody heard directly from her? Why had there been no confirmed phone call, no verified sighting by family, no financial activity, no explanation at all? As the days passed, the case became increasingly uncertain. And then, about a month after Susan vanished, another seemingly unrelated discovery would take place hundreds of miles away in Illinois. At the time, nobody realized the 2 cases might be connected. Within only a few weeks of Susan disappearing, the investigation had already started moving in a different direction. On January 8, 1993, only around 2 weeks after Susan vanished, Clarksville police ended the active search effort. The missing persons case technically remained open, but the large-scale search stopped. For Susan's family, that decision became deeply frustrating. According to later interviews, her relatives never believed she would willingly disappear. They also struggled to understand how a pregnant mother with 3 small children could supposedly vanish without contacting anybody she loved. But the situation became even stranger months later. In 1993, investigators reportedly received information about a woman living in Alabama who claimed to be Susan Lund. Authorities appeared to take the claim seriously. At one point, officials even publicly suggested Susan had been found alive and did not want contact with her family. That revelation changed the public perception of the case dramatically. To many people, it appeared to confirm the rumor that Susan had abandoned her children and intentionally started over somewhere else. But Susan's family did not accept it. Relatives later traveled to Alabama themselves to see the woman in person, and according to Susan's sister, they immediately realized the woman was not Susan at all. Despite that, though, the damage had already been done. For years afterward, Susan's children grew up surrounded by uncertainty, rumors, and conflicting stories about what happened to their mother. Her daughter, Crystal, later spoke openly about the emotional effect this had on her childhood. At different points, she believed her mother might still come home. She later became angry and convinced herself that Susan had willingly left. And according to Crystal, some relatives allegedly reinforced that belief by telling her deeply negative stories about her mother over the years. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another investigation was unfolding hundreds of miles away. An unidentified woman, discovered in Illinois, had already been given a name by investigators, Jane Doe. On January 27, 1993, roughly 1 month after Susan Lund disappeared, 2 young girls were playing near a wooded roadway inside Wayne Fitzgerald State Park in Ina, Illinois. What they discovered would become one of the most disturbing unidentified person cases that the state had ever seen, when, hidden near the roadside, was the head of an unknown female. Investigators quickly responded to the scene. The remains were located near Rend Lake, a large reservoir surrounded by wooded recreational areas and campsites. Authorities had no idea who the victim was. The woman was believed to be white. She had long reddish hair. She also had extensive dental work, including a silver filling. Investigators estimated she was somewhere between 30 and 50 years old, and, well, Susan Lund was only 25. Forensic investigators also believe the victim may have suffered from torticollis, sometimes called wry neck syndrome, due to asymmetry in the skeletal structure of the jaw and neck. As a result, the original forensic sketches exaggerated these supposed facial abnormalities quite heavily. The reconstruction distributed to the public showed a woman with a noticeably tilted face and severe asymmetry. That reconstruction is now one of the most recognizable to ever exist. And according to later investigators, that may have unintentionally pushed people away from recognizing her. the unidentified victim became known only as Jane Doe. Despite the disturbing nature of the discovery, investigators were unable to identify her, and the two investigations never connected. There were other deeply unsettling details as well. Investigators believed the victim had likely passed only 2 or 3 days before the remains were discovered. If accurate, that potentially meant the woman had remained alive for weeks, in the time frame after Susan disappeared from Tennessee. Even more disturbing was the fact that only the head was officially recovered. The rest of the body was never officially located. Years later, Susan's daughter Crystal learned that several campers and hikers who had been near the park around that time allegedly reported seeing what appeared to be a headless body in the lake nearby. To public knowledge, no confirmed recovery was ever made. The case slowly went cold. The forensic sketch circulated for years. A clay reconstruction was also created, but nobody came forward to identify the woman. And eventually, the unidentified victim in Illinois and the missing mother in Tennessee became two completely separate, forgotten cold cases. For nearly 30 years, nobody realized what to us now seems obvious. For decades, the case remained frozen in time. Susan Lund was still officially missing. Jane Doe was still unidentified. And the people closest to Susan continued living with uncertainty year after year. Then, in 2021, the investigation suddenly changed direction. Dr. Amy Michael, an anthropology professor at the University of New Hampshire, contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Illinois and offered to re-examine the Jane Doe case using updated forensic methods. Working alongside writer and researcher Laura Norton, Michael began reviewing the original evidence with fresh eyes. One of the first major conclusions involved the forensic reconstruction itself. According to the new analysis, the original sketches had likely exaggerated the victim's skeletal asymmetry, possibly to the point where it did more harm than good. While the woman may have had some irregularity in her jaw or neck structure, investigators no longer believed she would have appeared nearly as distorted as the original reconstruction suggested. A new forensic image was commissioned through artist Carl Koppelman. At the same time, scientists pursued something unavailable during the early 1990s investigation. That was forensic genetic genealogy. DNA samples from the remains were sent to Astrea Forensics in California to build a profile suitable for genealogy testing. That profile was then uploaded to GEDmatch by Redgrave Research Forensic Services in February 2022. The breakthrough happened astonishingly quickly. According to investigators involved in the case, genealogists identified a likely family connection within hours. The DNA trail led directly toward a missing woman from Tennessee. That missing woman was Susan Lund. Law enforcement contacted Susan's surviving relatives and requested comparison samples. A sibling provided DNA for direct testing. On March 6, 2022, investigators officially confirmed that Jane Doe and Susan Lund were, in fact, the same person. After nearly 30 years, Susan finally had a name again.
Welcome to News 2 at 10. I'm Bob Mueller.
And I'm Haley Wilgus. Lund's head was found in an Illinois state park 30 years ago, but the identification was only recently confirmed. News 2's Chelsea Beimfor spoke with her daughter about the decades-long investigation and how it altered her entire life.
So I have nothing but good memories of her. So it was pretty rough, especially as a teenager growing up without her, needing my mom. I always thought every woman with red hair was my mother, so I always assumed she was still alive. It frustrates me that the cops stopped searching for her after 2 weeks, because there's a chance they could have found her before that. So my mom's been running wild about what happened to her. That had been horrifying for her.
So now her family has confirmation that Lund is dead, but it opens up a lot more questions about the homicide investigation, mainly who did it and why. If you have any information on Lund's death or disappearance, you can call Clarksville Police or the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Their contact information is up.
For Susan's family, the identification brought both grief and relief. Her sister Pamela Reyes later said she cried for most of the day after learning the results. But alongside the grief was something else. Validation. For decades, Susan's children had lived with rumors that their mother abandoned them voluntarily. Now there was no longer any doubt. Susan had not disappeared to start over, she had been murdered. And according to her family, that confirmation mattered enormously to the children she left behind, especially to her son, who had spent much of his life trying to understand why his mother never came home. But while Susan's identification solved one mystery, it immediately reopened another far darker one. Who ended her time, and what actually happened between Christmas Eve 1992 and the discovery in Illinois 1 month later. Even after Susan Lund was identified, investigators were left with an enormous number of unanswered questions. In some ways, identifying Susan only made the story more disturbing, because now there was a confirmed and horrifying timeline. Susan disappeared from Clarksville, Tennessee on Christmas Eve 1992. Then, around a month later, her remains were discovered near Rend Lake in Illinois. That gap in time has never been fully explained. Investigators originally believed the victim discovered in Illinois had passed only days before the remains were found. If that estimate was correct, it raises the possibility that Susan may have remained alive for weeks after leaving her home. There is still no public explanation for where she may have been during that time. There is also the question of transportation. Susan did not own a car, and she disappeared while reportedly walking to a grocery store. Yet somehow she ended up hundreds of miles away in another state. No confirmed witness has ever publicly explained how that happened. Then there is the Alabama mystery. Who was the woman who claimed to be Susan Lund in 1993? And why did investigators at the time appear so convinced by the story? That false lead changed the entire direction of the case. It reinforced the theory that Susan had voluntarily abandoned her children. Other questions involve the handling of the original investigation itself. Susan reportedly had extensive dental work, including a silver filling. Yet despite this, no successful identification was made during the 1990s. There are also unresolved reports that campers and hikers near Wayne Fitzgerald State Park may have seen what appeared to be a headless body in the lake around the same time frame the remains were discovered. To public knowledge, the remainder of Susan's body has never officially been recovered. So, this could have been a missed opportunity to gather evidence and to give closure to Susan's family. And then there are the allegations made years later by Susan's daughter Crystal. Crystal publicly stated that a relative once claimed to have witnessed Paul Lund physically attack Susan during their marriage. She also described him as struggling heavily with alcoholism during his military service. However, these claims remain allegations, and no public evidence has directly connected Paul to Susan's case. Paul himself passed in 2020, 2 years before Susan was identified. Today, the case officially remains unsolved. Investigators in Illinois and Tennessee continue asking for information about Susan's movements and location. After December 24, 1992, there is still a standing reward for information leading to answers. And after more than 30 years, Susan's family continues asking the same question they have lived with since Christmas Eve, 1992. What actually happened to Susan? Please do let me know if you'd like to see more Jane Doe videos kinda like this one, and whether you prefer cases that have already been solved, or if you like cases that are still ongoing and that are still totally up in the air. I know people tend to have strong opinions on that, and since I've been posting daily, your feedback has genuinely helped me understand what kinds of stories resonate most with this community, this family. If there are any specific Jane Doe cases you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments. It doesn't matter if the case is famous, obscure, solved, unsolved, or somewhere in between. I'm always looking for stories that deserve more attention, and some of the best ideas I've covered on this channel have come directly from viewers. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on things like video length, series ideas, or any other suggestions that might help me make better content for all of you. I do read far more comments than you probably realize, and your feedback genuinely does shape the direction of the channel. One thing that always stays with me after researching these cases is just how many people are still waiting to be identified. Even today, There are believed to be around 50,000 unidentified human remains cases across the United States. Behind every one of those files is a real person, a real family, and a story that remains unfinished. Thankfully, advances in DNA technology and forensic genealogy are solving more of these mysteries every year. Cases that once seemed impossible are now being solved decades later, giving names back to people who had lost them, and, in some cases, finally providing answers to the families who never stopped searching. As always, thank you for watching, thank you for supporting the channel, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.